Bonjour and good morning, everybody, and thanks for attending the second session of the morning. The title is Defining the Red Line in Research. During the session, we're going to dig deeper into some of the questions that have been raised so far regarding anticipation, and we focus in particular on the role of the scientific community, self-regulation, and we have an esteemed panel of contributors from different angles that will certainly lead to an interesting and rich discussion. My name is Andrea Boggio. I'm a legal scholar. I'm one of the academics who's helping GESDA with the knowledge base foundations of their work on science diplomacy. I will tell you a little bit more about my contribution after we hear from the first speaker, Patrick Ebicher, who is Vice Chairman of GESDA and President Emeritus of the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, who is going to give some opening remarks, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. I have several hats here. It's true, as a Vice Chair of GESDA, as a past President of University, EPFL, and also as a neuroscientist. And the question we to ask, and this is a bit of a delicate issue, and we're struggling, to be honest, at GESDA, is the question: is there a red line in research? So if I take my hat of a university president, I would be rather reluctant, because what we're trying to do is to hire the best brains to try to do the most disruptive, because there's this curiosity-driven research, which is at the base of everything we do. And we tend, as scientists, to say, we should have the freedom to study whatever we think is interesting. And the easy position is said, but we will engage about the utilization of it. That has been, I would say, the classical route. But now what we see at GESDA is a series of things that are posing really very fundamental questions. It's not the first time, because when you look at the history of certainly life science, Asilomore in 1975 was the first, I would say, certainly in the life science, of people asking themselves the question and coming with a moratorium. But at the same time, this was more related to the utilization. And they came with guidelines of how to use recombinant technology. You saw this on the AI. Again, people say a certain moratorium and so on. But nobody has said that, or it's very difficult to say, is there a red line where curiosity research should not be allowed? And I think that's really at the heart of what I'm trying to answer. To give an example, and then just for the people who were at the neurotechnology meeting, this is a very interesting, it's a very good example for me, not because I'm a neuroscientist, but also because it's not just a technology. When you look at it, people were speaking about reading the brain, and it's very interesting if you're locked-in syndrome or if you're tetraplegic, as we saw last night. But are we ready when I would go to brain hacking? Are we ready to let technologies so that we can, guess thoughts of people just as a society? Is there something there? We've thought about Ming-Wang Pu, who's fantastic research on transgenic, but at the same time, you could go on, are we ready to let, humanization of non-human primates? Can we think about endowing primates to speak? This is not unforeseeable. But today is probably the time, if we think as a society this should not happen, we may consider a red line. But it's going to be extremely difficult to get this equilibrium between this curiosity-driven research, which is at the heart of our species, to know what are we, where are we, because it's trying to answer the fundamental question. So are we ready to self-impose ourselves? That's one thing. And the second thing is, if we are, how to define it, how to implement it. And we've heard, the first thing is the scientific community ready to self-regulate, to have guidelines, code of conduits? That's probably something that the science community is ready to do it, but at the same time, I think we have to realize as scientists, we're not the only one. We're not the only one that could just decide. It needs to go way beyond what we are. So should we go down to soft laws, recommendation, or what we heard from, like in Chile, having legally binding frameworks? But this is, something, and I think this is really at the heart of GESDA. We're trying to anticipate to the point that we give us the time to know if something needs to be done. And I think the question of the red line, you've put it, defining the red line, I would still say, is it, conceivable? Are we ready to put red lines? And if so, how we would do it? And I think maybe that's my last thing, I think we need to bring the society as a whole, but it's also the actors that can have an impact on that. And I see three of them, or four. First, the very technical one is the funding agencies, because, and they've been very different between public and private. For example, when we looked at embryonic research in the United States, there's a very interesting, where a state said there is no support, where the private institution said, no, we're going to fund it. There's the publishers. So we've seen some of the top journal, the Nature and so on, but some of our Chinese colleagues decided to get their own so that there was no consensus. So that some of the things that we said, if we cross this line, we should not be able to publish it. And last one, which is maybe a more pragmatic one, and that's something that we should probably think about it, is the commercialization of some of this research. So if you would take this incentive out, and certainly that's where the IP is extremely important. And also we have the advantage in this city, that's why GESDA is in this city, where we have a lot of international organization, but for example, WIPO is at the core of what we define. So is there in human augmentation, for example, are we ready to prevent the commercial utilization of human augmentation? So we could define smaller areas without being too ambitious. So I see a lot of different things, but probably the most fundamental is, for us as GESDA, we would be delighted to hear this panel and the people to know, should GESDA do something about it, which is probably at the very core of what we are, by anticipating setting a line in the sand. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these comments that link this panel to the general work of GESDA. I think the angle we take here is also to think about the ecosystem in which science is produced. And so we have actors in that ecosystem, so the scientific community can be imagined or construed a little bit more broadly than just scientists. So we're going to hear different voices from that ecosystem. I think with the open ears from GESDA perspective to understand how the organization can really contribute to this very important piece of anticipation. If you look at the radar, on page 244, there is something that I wrote for the radar, where I try to conceptualize a little bit what I call responsible anticipation, the anticipation performed by or within the scientific ecosystem. I'll let you go there and read it. I'm just going to say a couple of things. Actually, it's the only contribution with a bibliography, so you even have the homework if you want to dig deeper. There are 2 points I want to make. One is this form of anticipation is linked to the human rights framework, and we heard that earlier and yesterday, in 2 ways. One is international human rights recognizes the freedom of research that scientists are endowed with, and the argument is that with freedom comes responsibility, and so responsible anticipation is an extension of the recognition of scientific freedom. But also the human rights to science, and more importantly, it's really a human rights that operate at the level of harnessing the benefits. So it's important, it's a right to share the benefits of scientific progress. And so that question of where do we draw the line so that we don't compromise progress, I think it's very important, and human rights really push that frontier to a certain extent. Now, in terms of analysis, I offer what I call the 3C framework. So the scientific ecosystem should engage in contemplation, which is the self-reflection of where we are, what we're going to do. And that's what we did this morning in the neurosciences. Control, which is the act of actually engaging in self-regulation, finding those red lines or tools to control how progress is made in science. And finally, communication. It's very important that the scientists also communicate their thoughts about anticipation, engage with policymakers, with society, and communicate, but also listen to. I think it's an exercise that needs to be contained within the sciences, but also happens in a larger societal context, as it's important for those bridges to be open and existing. Read my contribution if you want to a little bit learn more about the sort of the intellectual approach to the problem. So we have a panel with 4 speakers. One will attend virtually. I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then I'm going to start with a round of questions. Remember, you can also join the conversation on social media following the hashtag GESDA Summit. So please do so if you are on social media. So to my left, we have François Rivasseau, who's a French diplomat and currently senior advisor for science diplomacy for the World Intellectual Property Organization. Then we have Cheryl Moore, the Chief Research Programs Officer at Wellcome in the United Kingdom, and also a newly minted board of GESDA. So congratulations and thank you for your service. Then we have Matthias Kaiser, Emeritus Professor, the Center for the Study of Sciences and the Humanities in Norway. And then from London, connected with us virtually, we have Robin Lovell-Badge, the head of the Laboratory of Stem Cells Biology and Developmental Genetics at the Francis Crick Institute in London. Robin, thanks for joining us. So I would like to start with Cheryl, and then I'm going to go to Robin, and then I'm going to open to the other 2 panelists with a sort of fundamental general question of, from your perspective as an actor in the ecosystem, what can be done today to guarantee responsible anticipation and the proper analysis of the issues that were raised earlier?
Thanks, Andrea. I think we've heard some really good framing for this issue. In the session earlier this morning, the phrase prudent vigilance was used. We need to balance prudent vigilance with not throttling innovation. So we need to find the right time, the right engagement, and global coordination around innovations in science. Scientists are often cited as being those who are best positioned to determine those red lines. I represent a large group of scientists, and they are deeply engaged in their work and know the potential for it. That said, there are other perspectives that must also be considered when we think about these things so that we have a well-rounded view. So we need the public engaged in these conversations. We need public and private funders. We need publishers. We need civil society. We need policymakers engaged from the very beginning. So there are a number of examples that are out there. Everybody's talking about AI. What's AI going to do? What do we need to do with AI? There's potential for good. There's potential for misinformation and other uses. So where does society belong in this debate? There are a few big voices right now that tend to dominate the conversation. So those are large industry, who are very close to it and have been investing in it for a long time. And those are some governments who have actively leaned in to look at AI. But there are many others who are not yet engaged, many because they don't know how and where to engage. So there's a lot of debate. The EU, the UK, the US have not yet closed in on where they land on this. China is regulating large language models. So there are different approaches and a lot of exploration going on. One model that's really interesting is the Pan-Canadian AI strategy, where in Canada they did a broad national awareness campaign and engaged the public, engaged ethicists, engaged policymakers, first off, to understand what we were talking about so there could be informed engagement, and then really convened around the ethical and social issues and aiming to define red lines. But they recognized that it had to start with real education and engagement in order to have an appropriate connection. Another example from something that we funded is a project called MindKind, which studied data stewardship in mental health research. So this is where people's data about them and mental health conditions is going to be used for research. So the question was, let's look at putting this data into three data repositories, and then see how it's best utilized. When participants were engaged, they said, can we pick which one gets our individual data? That engagement changed the nature of the project because we had their support to move forward. And that sense of control and engagement in the process makes all the difference. Because if we're going to push the frontiers of discovery and innovation, we have to have the trust of the public. Because if we don't, we will have significant regulation, and everything's a pendulum, right? So we need to, again, as I said in the beginning, find that right balance. And if we don't engage appropriately, the pendulum will swing very far, and it will be hard to advance, and will throttle innovation too early. So what can we do? So we're a funder. It's important that we be able to address these issues from the beginning. We fund social scientists to look at issues like this. We bring people together. It's important for funders like us to make funds available for this sort of debate and discussion, in addition to the basic fundamental research that we fund.
Thank you very much. Yeah. I'd like to move virtually to Robin and see, I guess, your input more from the field, probably, from the lab. So please, Robin.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I guess a few things have already been said that I concur with. But I just want to stress that one of the problems in drawing red lines is that, of course, different jurisdictions, different countries may want to put those red lines in very different places for a variety of historical, religious, or other cultural reasons. And that always poses an issue, particularly in the sorts of things I'm going to talk about. So, first of all, I'm generally of the view that science should be open and allowed to explore different avenues. But I agree that in some cases that it can go too far, and things like dual-use research is one area which always provokes concern. But in others, it may be too far, not because ultimately there's not some good things that can come out of it, but just currently things may not be appropriate to use. And the obvious example, which I will raise in a minute, is genome editing, where we can have, there's a potential for heritable genome editing. But let me touch upon a few other things that I've covered in my history. But the important thing, I think, is scientists absolutely do have the role of being proactive. They should be the ones highlighting areas where the technologies are raising issues that may be challenging societal views, challenging society, where the regulations and governance may be challenged and need to be dealt with. So scientists should be proactive, and that's occurred in my involvement with science policy on a number of occasions, and that would be, for example, nuclear transfer, and the prospect of reproductive cloning, which of course was generally agreed not to be allowed, and that's for very good reasons. But also mitochondrial replacement techniques, which now are being used in the UK, and Australia has approved the use of the technologies. But of course, other countries don't want to go anywhere near it because it's they're concerned about it sort of messing around with early human life too much. There's the issues about making mixtures of human and animal, whether that's putting, let's say, modifying genes in human embryos, or using genome editing again, or putting human cells in or genes into animal cells or genes into human embryos, or the other way around, making animals containing human material, whether that's cells or DNA. And these issues have all been raised actually by the scientists before they've gone anywhere, and that's led to, at least in the UK, I think, pretty reasonable regulations. They need updating some of them a bit, but they're pretty reasonable. The issue of genome editing, again, the whole notion that this could be used for making changes to the human genome in a heritable fashion was raised by, of course, Jennifer Doudna, one of the inventors of the techniques of CRISPR. And that was discussed at a meeting, and then other meetings came out of that. I've been involved with 3 summit meetings every 3 or 4 years on the whole topic of human genome editing, which have covered everything from therapeutic approaches to treat patients, so that would be somatic genome editing, to the prospect of heritable genome editing. In all cases, the conclusion has been that the techniques are good and should be applied for treating patients, so somatic genome editing. But there's some big issues there, which are partly regulatory, but not only. So it's equity and access becomes the real big issues at the moment. And for heritable genome editing, of course, we've always said the techniques are not yet safe enough to use. There are instances where they might be used, but not yet. But of course, in 2018, a Chinese scientist talked actually at the summit meeting then in Hong Kong that he had used CRISPR on a number of human embryos, had 2 twins born then, and a 3rd baby has been born subsequently. Of course, this created a huge fuss. But you might want to know, why was that allowed to occur in China and not elsewhere? And that's a long story. But it's clear that he was not really open to international colleagues well enough. There was he must have had a lot of local support to do what he did, and it wasn't illegal. Although he spent 3 years in jail, it was then because of he was jailed for practicing medicine without a license. So the system wasn't in place in China to deal with it. In other countries around the world, there'd already been effective bans on heritable genome editing, but there wasn't in China. There is now. What was missing was something like a mechanism of whistleblowing. So a few scientists outside of China did know what he was doing, but they didn't know who to tell. So that was a big issue. And so he was probably largely self-funding himself in this research. I don't know, we don't know exactly, but he was quite wealthy because he had made a lot of money from sequencing technology and selling a company that developed that. So the normal funders like Wellcome wouldn't have had any control over that. He just went and did it himself. So you need other mechanisms to help, to know what's going on. And that's why I'm saying that something like some mechanism, loosely called whistleblowing, it's not exactly whistleblowing, but where problems can be raised is a big issue. I was on the WHO committee that looked at the governance of human genome editing, and we covered a whole range of things in our report. There's no simple, clear mechanism of having worldwide governance of human genome editing, whether it's somatic or heritable. But many, many different things can act on that. And some of those really need pushing a bit. But being open, openness is so important. Openness in science in general is important. What can you do? What are the goals? What do you want to do? And then involving others in any decisions, not just the scientists themselves making any decisions, but it has to involve members of the bioethics community, social sciences, legal experts, and members of the public. And my big message is going to be repeated a few times probably, is that you have to involve the public as soon as you can in having these discussions in an appropriate way with proper engagement where you're really getting their views and see what's important to them. So public engagement is so important. So I've probably had my few minutes, so I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much for your insights. We'll come back. So I guess we're going to take a slightly different or broader approach now. I go back to Francois and his experience as a diplomat and also as an advisor in intellectual property.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mandre. I work also for WHO, so this gives me a number of corners where to talk from. I would try to build upon what has been already said by the three previous speakers. And the first question raised by our dear chair of EPFL, where I have one son, do we have red lines? And the answer for me is obvious. Yes, we already have a lot of red lines in science, and we shall continue to have them. The problem is not to know if we need red lines. The problem is to know how to build them and for doing what. We have red lines. I spent 15 years in non-proliferation and disarmament. We have red lines on nuclear weapons, on chemical weapons, on BW weapons. It's more difficult, obviously, to monitor the red lines in a biological lab than in a nuclear plant, but experience of this specific field since 30 years now shows us that it is feasible, it is fairly feasible. So I think that red lines, yes, they may be built. The problem is what red lines, how to draw a red line between the necessary freedom of research that Robin highlighted and the need of safety, security, and respect of ethics, which that's the difficulty that we face. Let's say if we need red lines, if we have red lines, the question is to know how to build them, how to elaborate them. And obviously the answer has been given. It has, particularly by Robin, who alluded to the difficulty of different jurisdiction, it has to be worldwide, otherwise it will not work. But the reality of today, with a decoupling between, strategic geopolitical decoupling between the West and China and Russia to caricature a bit the situation, makes particularly difficult to conceive such an effort, but necessary. In WHO, where I work on the reform of international health regulation, we are hoping to achieve something. And it is not impossible. In some fields of cooperation between scientists, we have been able to maintain a number of links. So we have to think with a new mantra, with a new software, if I may say so. We have to find a new software to ensure communication at global level about the various scientific labs, to ensure that a minimalistic global capacity of building red line is preserved. Where to do that? Obviously, in international organization, the ethical rules belongs to UNESCO, and then some specialized agencies such as WHO, WIPO, obviously, I shall come back to it a bit later, have a fundamental role to play. Now, how to elaborate the red line? It has to start, in my view, from two angles. First, the civil society and the governments, ideally building up on the civil society feelings, and the scientific community on the other hand, because they are the only one who really know what we are talking about. Seen from my specific angle, which worked with scientists for decades as a diplomat, The general principles are for the governments and for the civil society. The concrete implementation is for the labs. And I trust the publishers, I trust the labs, or the labs network. I trust less, if I may say so, the funding agencies, and even less the commercialization. Sorry.
Okay.
Well, now, what avenue to take? How to build concretely that? What is urgent? I will then take my WIPO hat and make the case that in many aspects, particularly for AI, which has been particularly highlighted, what is absolutely needed in AI, I chair the AI discussions in WIPO since 4 years, it is needed to have a WIPO common approach of AI, both the inputs and the outputs. We don't know what the rules really applicable are. And obviously, when you don't know the WIPO rules, what happens? Nobody knows who is responsible for what. So how can you draw a red line if nobody knows who is entitled to cross it or not, who will be responsible if a red line is crossed or not? The nice thing in intellectual property is it allows to define the owners, the inventors, the beneficiaries, or the authors. So basically, pending an agreement on IP, we will be able to draw a red line to know who is responsible for what, and then we should be able to say, you can do that, or you should not go beyond that point at this stage, without further reflection. It has also another good aspect if you use IP rules. It protects the inventor or the author. It protects him against the big commercialization systems in ensuring that his own rights are respected. And an aspect which is often misunderstood about IP protection is it appears more and more today worldwide with the development of IP systems in the developing world as a way of protecting development. A number of inventions made in the developing world now are serving first the developing world rights and the principle of equity, which is so vitally important, while before that was not so much the case. So basically, if you want to be able to draw red lines which would be worldwide represented, IP approach is also an equitable approach which allows to give more legitimacy to the red lines. Now, I will stop at this point to elaborate what should be done immediately. Maybe it's a bit later on down the road. Thank you.
Matthias, I'll let you take it from here.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm very happy. I think this is a very important discussion that is going on here. And I have worked a lot about science and ethics, and it may maybe surprise you that I'm not a great fan of trying to define more red lines for research. That much said, I very much agree with what other people have said about the importance of public engagement. Now, let me explain a little bit. First of all, why skeptical about red lines? First of all, if we look at the history of science, we see that there have been many red lines in history, like not being allowed to cut up dead bodies to learn something about human physiology. But also there have been new red lines that were not observed earlier, like animal experiments coming up, you know. So we have a dynamic there. And that dynamic is very much due to a historical, to a cultural development of the surrounding society. It's always embedded in something. Now, I think it is very important to have some red lines, particularly related to human rights, right, and human dignity. I think that is an important thing. I think we have them more or less in place already. I think most of them are there. I also think that, in general, red lines are very fragile. There was this example mentioned about germline modification in China. You see, if you look at the global scale, there is always a danger that from another cultural, economical setting, red lines will be broken, and then other countries will feel like, oh, we are hanging afterward, we are not really doing, what one could do. So red lines, I don't think, do the thing. However, I very much share the opinion that we have heard here that there are so many developments in current science that raise ethical or value dilemmas for us. AI has been mentioned. Neurosciences have been mentioned. My field is food science a lot. There is enormous dilemmas in terms of value dilemmas. And there are others, and organoids in medical research, right? And all of these. Now, mostly, that kind of research is based on a scientific community with very good intentions. Oh, sorry, another example I want to mention is xenotransplantation. I was just recently at a European conference on organ donation, and I just learned, which was to my surprise, that basically we can count on the next xenotransplantation of a pig heart to a human next year already, here in Europe. Afterwards, it will be in the United States, right? And there is a lot of issues. Now, the people that work on that have very good intentions and work for the benefit, in this case, for the patient. Now, what they don't really disregard, or what they don't really regard sufficiently, is probably all the other risks to public health, in xenosis, for example. Now, what we need is very often a discussion of the trade-offs. How far can we go with these risks? How important is the benefit that you see? How can we maybe modify it, or maybe can we place it in a regulatory environment where it works better? Now, these are real issues in many areas, right? So what is the way to go? Yes, and there also I have great belief, and I've worked on a paper on transdisciplinarity for the International Science Council. The real challenge is to broaden the scope of the scientific practice. Don't let that researcher that works in one of those fields being alone. Embed these researchers in a larger context. Now, that is, first of all, and that is very often the easiest one, an interdisciplinary one. Just go to another faculty in your university or wherever you are. And that is difficult enough, because typically we don't share the language even. It takes such a long time to have good interdisciplinary development. But that is not enough, because as you mentioned, what is at stake is very much also the trust of society in the science that we do. So we need to engage with society, with different groups, with the public in general. And that means not just communicating, telling them how good we are, but also listening, right? Listening to them and starting a dialogue and say, okay, what do you think we should do? Have you some kind of knowledge that you can contribute? And very often they have. Practical knowledge, indigenous knowledge. Amazingly, what I found is, perhaps this is a prejudice, but it seems easier in the global south sometimes to get these projects going, because with publics, because the pressure to change is larger, right? Like, as I said, in the food sciences, we have seen this where people work together, scientists work together across disciplines with indigenous communities to change their food production and to take care of biodiversity and all of this. So what my call is basically not for work on defining always new red lines, but working out these value dilemmas that we face in our research, in this anticipation or into this anticipatory process, and seek to broaden the dialogue around those researchers. And that is, and I very much agree with that, very much also dependent upon the funding agencies, publication, because in the end, the scientist has to ask herself or himself, what's my benefit in that, right? I need to publish, for my career, and like this. And we have to break through these mechanisms. There must be merit other than the number of publication in high-level journals. There must be merit, and there must be funding also for long-term projects. So I think this is where we really should interact the basis of the scientific community, which mostly consists of very well-meaning scientists and good people, right? But too often we narrow their scope, and we have to extend that. So this is, I'll stop here. I can say more, but yeah.
Very good.
Thank you very much. What a thoughtful panel. We have almost running out of time. So I would like to do two things, though. One is maybe open to the floor. If there is one or two questions. I think it's an interesting conversation, and I want to make sure that there are, if there are voices, that we can capture them. And there is a microphone. If you want to ask a question, please identify yourself and be brief. And so that's coming down there. Okay, as we get there, I just want to give you some time also to think about my last question, which will actually be given this sort of thick background, which we fundamentally all agree with. What would be one specific intervention, whether it's an incentive or a mechanism or something that you think, from your perspective, that could be implemented, given your, fairly, your analysis of the problem, and whether this is something that it can be coming from your angle or can be something that GESDA can pick up, because GESDA has been tinkering with different ideas. So, but we have a couple of questions, and then maybe we can save 5 minutes for that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for the very interesting panel. I have a question regarding...
Sorry, can you introduce yourself? Oh, yeah.
Yes, I am Carl Thibault. I work at the Institut Quantique Quantum Institute in Sherbrooke, Quebec, Canada. I have a background in physics. I heard a couple of people mention that scientists should be the one that define the red lines from an ethical standpoint, but in my experience, most scientists have basically no background in this, and they have no training at all, like in the bachelor's degrees and everything. We don't really have courses in ethics. So I'm just wondering, why do you believe that they're the ones that should do this while they have no training in this? Thank you.
We can collect a couple of questions, and maybe one and two. Thanks for being brief. You can introduce yourself. Thank you. Yeah.
Actually, I want to make a comment. I'm Pascal Fong. I'm an AI researcher since 1988. I currently am a professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, but also a visiting faculty researcher at Google. I don't know, maybe you should answer his question before. I actually want to answer his question, can I? So I just want to say,
can I just say, use a minute and do whatever you feel
I just want to say, in AI, we do have different levels of ethics committees at every single conference. Every single journal review committee consists of scientists. You're right. We were not trained in ethics, but we learn. And we work with ethicists, and we work with social scientists and psychologists all the time. It's not perfect, but we mean well. Thank you for your comment. We come in peace, and we're trying to do the best. But I'm here to engage with the public, and many of us are doing that. But there are voices that are detrimental to the progress, not just to science, but also to the beneficial development of technology in AI. And I think the only way forward, 30 seconds, the only way forward for AI is for us to have our research to be transparent. So completely disclosing what we actually bring, our results, what we actually bring to the market. So open source, open science, and then it can be open to public comments, open to regulator auditing, and so on. That open science is the only way forward, in my opinion. So.
Thank you. One more, and then we come back here.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm Daniel Baccinello. I'm Director of Research at the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, which manages the Pan-Canadian AI strategy, so really pleased to hear that called out. My question relates to the other one, actually. There was talk of regulation and red lines drawn around things like nuclear weapons, but it's much more challenging to, when you work backwards, before a technology is developed, to regulate. So how do we regulate, for example, fundamental physics, right? It's easy to regulate once the technology is produced. So I was wondering just if you could comment on that pipeline, sort of the difficulty in regulating things at the earlier stages, or drawing red lines around things when we don't know necessarily the outcomes of the research or the outcomes of the technology. And by the time it's sufficiently developed, the risk is already sort of existing in our world. And that sort of builds on previous questions. So thank you.
So we have more food for thought, and I have my question, so we'll go in the same order, and I'll let you answer my question, maybe pick up some of the comments. Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you. I would say, commenting on the last one, I would go back to the concept of prudent vigilance, right? So we don't want to throttle new innovations too early, or they'll never get out of the gate. But we need to be aware early on of the potential and have the right community, as we've discussed, engaged in discussion so that we're ready to act at the appropriate time. Going to the other question about what the heck do we do, I think we must focus on global collaboration. Some examples were given where different countries or different organizations are implementing different standards. The world is global. We have to do this together. So we've got to bring the community together. One thing that we haven't talked about is our technology advances that cross borders. So in climate change, there are new technologies rolling out, and there will be more. Cloud seeding, for instance. If you implement cloud seeding, which does happen now, which will increase precipitation, it's going to have an influence in the country that made the decision to go ahead and implement that technology, but it will also have an impact on neighboring countries. How are we going to manage that? This has to be a policy discussion. It has to be addressed globally. So the American Geophysical Union was looking at desalination and carbon capture technologies and made a first step to doing this sort of work by involving small island nations in that early on. And we need to do more of that. There are a number of entities that are aiming to tackle these types of questions. The knowledge that is needed is specific, so they're often very narrowly defined because the questions within that are so broad. So examples are the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, the Institute for Neuroethics was mentioned in the prior session, the Global Infectious Disease Ethics Forum, the Nuffield Council of Bioethics. There are many. And what they do is they bring communities together. They serve as conveners, all these different voices that we've heard. And when they work well, they deliver principles and guidelines that the community can get behind. And they can also serve as an open voice when there needs to be some pushback. So I think this is an approach forward. It's that convening, that bringing everyone together, but it has to be grounded deeply in slow and thoughtful reflection to fully understand the downstream ramifications.
Okay. Robin, we go to Patrick first, and then, yeah.
To try to answer your question, I think it's really at the heart of what GESDA is we're trying to do, and the fact that we're asking thousands of scientists to try to anticipate. We know it's very difficult. We more or less know as we write our grant proposal at 3 to 5 years, or at least we try to anticipate because that's a justification. At 10, it's kind of borderline. At 25, we have the impression it's science fiction. However, I think the scientists are probably the best positioned to say, the cutting scientists in those areas, to say what might come. And I think this is so we as scientists feel rather uncomfortable because, it's this line of thing. However, and I think speaking about the needs of ethicists, of legal people and so on, that's the core of GESDA, is to bring this, but bring them, if we wait too long, and we're going to speak only when we're, feel comfortable, then it's too late. And I think the problem that I see, we've seen an incredible acceleration of the pace of those discovery. and the breadth taking is not only recombinant. You know, we've heard from AI to neurotechnology to organoids and so on. We've never seen as many technologies that could have red lines, or at least that would need prudent vigilance. And I think the whole idea of GESDA is really to have this dialogue and have the policy people participating and framing, you know, the utilization of those research.
Thank you. Robin, if you have a couple of minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I just say I totally agree with what was just said and with Cheryl's comments. You know, so I think scientists themselves shouldn't be drawing the red lines. I don't think that's fair, but they should be raising the issues that where they see there may be a red line probably ought to be drawn. Actually, scientists don't mind working within well-defined boundaries, so they don't mind red lines necessarily. Occasionally, of course, they will want those changed, and we're seeing this in the UK, and we're seeing it in other countries too at the moment, about, again, back to embryology. So the 14-day rule was thought about in the 1980s and established in UK law in 1990, meaning you can't culture a human embryo for more than 14 days. But of course, at that time, the technology was not there, was nowhere near to be able to culture in a human embryo for that long. But now it is here, and it's been here for a few years. And there is a lot of pressure from scientists and others to change that red line. And that requires a lot of public engagement. And it's going to be, and actually welcome of been funding a project in the UK to do exactly that. It's gone very well. That is one of the areas where I think it's going to be very hard to have a worldwide agreement on things like embryo research, human embryo research, and application of techniques to human embryos. But what you need is you know, guidelines which specify the minimum standards, if you like, that should be followed, that are accepted by countries around the world, but jurisdictions where they don't want to be involved in any of this accept that it can be done in other countries that approve it. And so you don't want situations which have occurred where scientists who want to work on human embryos coming from one country can get prosecuted if they ever come back to that country. Stupid things like that sort of reach over, which is completely unhelpful. And public engagement, stress again, is so important to this. And Wellcome are very good in that they do provide funding for this, but there are many funding organizations that do not, and it can be a big struggle for scientists in other countries to do a proper public engagement exercise. Indeed, they don't probably even know what we mean by proper public engagement, where you're having a true dialogue with members of the public, which is not cheap to do. But we need to instill in scientists as they're growing up the importance of public engagement and how to facilitate. If they need or they think it needs to be done in a particular area, then they need to know who to talk to make it happen, which I think a lot of them don't know.
Okay, thank you. We have 1 minute each. If you have some, yep.
Thank you. Well, I very much agree with what has been said. So let's make that a bit lively. You have wished, Madame, to engage with us, so I shall try to answer your wish. There is a difference between biotechnologies, where the reflections on red lines and ethics is 30 or 40 years old, and AI, because AI is so new. You have said that the first answer, well, at least governmental and public opinion reflection. Obviously, in science fiction, in the robotic Asimov, we have heard a lot about it. But concretely, we are not faced with a phenomenon. Now, you argue, and this is very good to hear, that transparency is the final answer to that. I beg your pardon to disagree partly. transparency is obviously very, very interesting, open sources, open results. But when it comes to AI, based on my 4 years of experience of chairing these discussions in WIPO with a lot of Google representatives, by the way, participating, we all know that it is not enough, because the way the artificial intelligence works, it works on the basis of data. You are, Google, probably the Western champion of collecting data for free from all over this. But we don't know how those data are used by the artificial intelligence. We barely know what data. I'm not sure you know all the data, and that you can be transparent on all the data you collect. Maybe you can, but I don't know how it could be done. But what is sure is that nobody knows how the artificial intelligence use the data, because precisely that's the system of deep learning makes that for the time being impossible to know. So transparency cannot be achieved there. That's why we need something more in addition. And in my view, the most pressing issue to take there, the most pressing thing to do is to try to engage into a worldwide negotiation in WIPO on that. Because of the situation, it has probably to be, it will be very difficult, because basically you have 3 jurisdictions, US, Europe, China. Maybe for GESDA would be good to organize some preliminary discussions at informal level between the representative of these 3 jurisdictions to see where we could arrive. Thank you.
Matthias, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, there's short time, I realize, but let me just try to briefly answer the interventions that we heard. First, to the gentleman from Canada. I totally agree. We need also to do something about how we educate our scientists. And there is differences in different continents, but even within Europe. In Norway, every PhD student in every subject has to take a whole semester course, well, a half semester course actually. Sorry, yes, in history, philosophy of science, and ethics, right? And it's very comprehensive. Similarly, in Sweden, it's less so in other countries in Europe, but it's still more or less around. And I think this is a model we have to do. We have to open up particularly those PhD students that will engage in research later on. Secondly, the lady over here, I agree with you actually that open science is the way to go. It may not be the only answer, I think, because, yeah, anyway, but open science includes also adequate communication. It means not only open science for other scientists, but adequate communication to the publics. And the third comment from this gentleman, yes, and what Patrick also was saying, we need to employ what's called ethics by design. That is, we have to go upstream already. We have to take these discussions in the very beginning and not at the end of the technology development, right? So this is important. And the final plea I want to add here is really that this is a plea to, well, to you, but also to the scientific community, that we shouldn't wait to have this imposed upon us top-down, be it UNESCO or any other organizations. We need, because of our own reflective capacities, we need to start that discussion and use those fora that you are and others for promoting that discussion and putting this discussion about anticipation of science more in the public realm, and have a voice where we are seen as also critical scientists, right? In some cases, we need to have what's called red teams, you know, like those that are from within the same community, but those that say, hey, there may be something ahead. We need to discuss that. There may be a risk or a danger, right? So those voices have to go together and be shown to the public, bottom up, at least from the scientific community. That's my plea. Okay.
Well, thank you for your thoughts. We started with $1 million question and we didn't answer, but I think it validates some of the work we are doing at GESDA and provided more food for thought. And this is a conversation where everybody should be engaged. And I want to thank the panelists in person and virtual for your thoughts and for attending these sessions, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.